All right, hello and welcome everyone to today's COVID-19 Vaccination Town Hall meeting. We're so glad you could join us, and I'm happy to turn it over to our Superintendent of Schools, Mary Elizabeth Davis.
Well, thanks, JD, and thanks for hosting us today, and to our viewers who have joined us, welcome. Good afternoon to educators and support professionals in education here in Henry County. First of all, it is an honor to be with you today and really to focus our discussion around the steps forward toward vaccine availability for educators. Now, as you know, it was last Friday, it was February 25th, that Governor Kemp moved educators and school staff to the eligibility category for vaccine administration starting on March 8th. Of course, our curiosity has only continued to emerge since that very time. Well, this has obviously been very encouraging, and although educators are going to be able to schedule their vaccine appointment at any public location, we are also eager here in Henry County Schools to offer employees a closed point of distribution for direct access into registering and scheduling a vaccine appointment. Of course, I am joined today by Dr. Madden, and Dr. Madden, if you could give me a wave. Dr. Madden has been responsible for leading our effort to bring vaccinations to our Henry County Schools employees and the educators throughout Henry County. And so, Dr. Madden, before I continue, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I'm just thrilled as well that we've had this opportunity, and we have a team that's working very diligently to make certain that you are able to start as soon as we receive those vaccines. So we appreciate it, and we look forward to the experience in Henry County Schools.
That's right. This is an important step forward for our community's health, and we're eager for those next steps. But of course, we are awaiting clarity on a couple of details that have yet to be determined. And that big clarity is the availability of doses that will be directed towards the Henry County community. As soon as we know that detail, we will communicate the opportunity to schedule an appointment at the Henry County Schools Learning and Support Center at Henry County Middle. But in the meantime, now is the moment to spend some time dedicated to getting educated and confident in your personal decision. Now, it's my trusted colleagues throughout the medical profession, but particularly at Piedmont Henry Hospital, that have spoken to the safety and the reliability of this vaccine. As you know, I speak frequently about the partnership that has emerged with Dr. Henson, the CEO of Piedmont Henry, along with Dr. Watkins, the Chief Medical Officer at Piedmont Henry, and both have testified to their own experiences being positive and incredibly encouraging. But it is also their recommendation that we as a school community and professionals in the education community spend some time with their trusted colleague, Dr. Jayne Morgan. And it is now my delight and pleasure to invite Dr. Morgan to join us here on our town hall to talk about vaccination safety and reliability and the opportunity for educators on the horizon. And Dr. Morgan, I am turning it over to you. Thank you for joining me today and for joining this important community conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mary Elizabeth, JD, Dr. Madden. I appreciate the opportunity to come. We always look forward to the opportunities to educate. Piedmont is moving forward with our partnerships with the community. And part of that, certainly within this COVID pandemic, is education, making certain people understand COVID, but also understand the vaccines, the vaccine distribution, and what that means. I know many people have many questions about the vaccine. So generally, I will start with giving you a personal experience, what it was like for me to take the vaccine, and then move on as we sort of warm up to how this vaccine even came to be. How did we get this vaccine so fast, and what does it mean? So I received the vaccine. I received the Moderna vaccine. I have received both doses, and I'm 2 weeks out from my second dose. My first dose, I really didn't have any symptoms. I had soreness of my arm and a little stiffness, but nothing that really caused any disability. My second dose, I had more symptoms. I had increasing soreness and stiffness to the point that I needed to take some Motrin. I had those myalgias, meaning those muscle pains, and I had them in my lower back. And then additionally, I had a mild fever, which also was taken care of with Motrin, and I had a headache for 2 mornings in a row. And so those are my symptoms. And that sort of let me know that my ribosomes, my immune system was really revving up. Because when we take these 2 doses, and I'm going to walk us through that. The first dose of the vaccine gets us up to about a 50 or 60% immunity, our 50 or 60% protection. But it's that second dose that takes us up to that big 95% efficacy, meaning how well it works that we hear about in the news. So when we go from 60 to 90%, we're really going to feel it. To give you an example, the flu shots, our flu shot on any given year is somewhere between 45 to 65% efficacy, and that's really it. And the FDA requirements of any vaccine are that it at least be 50%. So for these 2, Moderna and Pfizer, to be 95%, they really knocked it out of the park. But you're going to feel your immune system really kick in to get ready to protect you. So I'm going to start with how do we get these vaccines so quickly? How did they come into being? So when we look at the virus that causes COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2, it's so named because this is the second time that we've seen it. We've seen this virus before, and we saw it initially in 2003 when we had our first SARS outbreak, severe acute respiratory syndrome. By and large, we were very lucky, and it was able to be contained outside of the United States. We then saw a very close relative in 2012, the MERS virus, the Middle Eastern respiratory virus. And again, this one was by and large able to be contained to Saudi Arabia. But in 2003, when we had our first outbreak, we began research on this family of coronaviruses. And in 2020, when COVID-19 came to be and was moving forward within our society, we had completed all of the preclinical work, 17 years of work on that. All of the bench work research had been completed. The identification of the spike protein as the key area of the coronavirus that caused infection had been identified. The method of action, meaning how does it do that? It does it by binding to these ACE receptors, these angiotensin converting enzyme receptors on our cells, had also been identified. The entire genomic sequence had been identified and analyzed, all 30,000 base pairs. So think about that, 17 years of work. All of that information was known before we even had our first case of COVID-19 here in the United States of America. So it didn't start on day 1, it started on day 17 years and some months. And then we start moving forward with the development of this vaccine. So all of that work had been done based on our initial outbreak. And when we talk about the SARS-CoV-2, that was an indication to all scientists, it's named number 2, that there was a number 1. And so we recognize number 1, when was that? That was in 2003. And that's where all of this work comes to bear. The second part that we have to think about is we adopted a new model of development of vaccines. So generally when we develop vaccines, they're in 3 phases, or even drugs, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1 is safety. Phase 2, by and large, is dose development. We're identifying what dose we're going to use. And then phase 3 is we're taking it out really to a broad swath of people to really see what the efficacy is. Generally, we don't start phase 2 until phase 1 has completely enrolled. All of the data is done. We call that database lock. It's all been analyzed. The FDA reviews it, and we move on to phase 2. And so these things are done in tandem, and they require time. What we did this time, because we were recognizing an emerging emergency, certainly after the World Health Organization announced that it was a pandemic, we adopted a different model of streamlining this, where instead of the phases being done in tandem, they were stacked on top of one another. And so what we did were interim analyses, meaning at the midway point of the phase 1, we looked at all the data, made sure that it was safe and that it was efficacious. And if those 2 criteria were met, we went ahead and started phase 2, even though phase 1 hadn't completed. Phase 2, we did the same thing. In the interim analysis, midway through, we took a look at the data. As long as the data had good safety and good efficacy, we went ahead and started phase 3. in the middle of phase 2. So in that way, we were able to stack them and streamline the process. The third thing that happened were resources became available. Resources, money, that's always important. By and large, almost unlimited funds to develop this. And what does that mean? How does that speed up a process? Well, it means you can hire more people to work on it. It means you can pull people from other projects within your organization and focus their effort on this. It means you can open more study sites and therefore enroll more patients much more quickly. And so resources really help to accelerate it. And then finally, remember, this is not FDA approved. This is under EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. What that means is there's an acknowledgement that all of the data was not complete at the time that it's being released to the public. But because we're under an emergency or under a pandemic, it has to meet certain criteria and move forward. So what data do we have? We had all of the safety data. You always have to make certain that it's safe. And we had all of the efficacy data, meaning how well it works. What data didn't we have? We didn't have that immunity data. That immunity data we get by following these patients out for 1 year, for 2 years, measuring their viral titers every month to determine how long the vaccine provides protection. In an emergency use authorization, the FDA will only require 2 months of that data to see if there's protection for 2 months, again, because we are in an emergency. And then they allow it to move forward. And we continue to collect that immunity data as time goes by. So at this point, we have about 5 or 6 months of immunity data. Next month, we'll have 7 months. The month after that, we'll have 8 months. The month after that, we'll have 9 months. We're really in this all in real time. So when people ask, will I have to take this vaccine every year, Dr. Morgan? Will I need to, or will this be a vaccine that we take every 10 years? That's the information we don't have because we're under an emergency use authorization. We literally are gathering all of the immunity data in real time. So stay tuned. We are actually seeking the answer to that, and that's how that will move forward. So this is how all of this came to bear so quickly. The FDA brings it under emergency use authorization. We have 17 years of research from our first SARS outbreak. We adopted a new model that did not impact safety, but streamlined the process, and then we poured resources into it. So other projects were sidelined such that experts could focus on this project. And so that's how we get those 17 years. It also answers the question that people often ask about immunity. Will I have to take this every year? Those are the questions that we don't have the answer to because we're under an emergency use authorization. So that's, I often generally like to start there because people always have questions about that. The other question that people ask about is the safety of these vaccines. And so when we look at the Moderna and the Pfizer trials, when we look at their phase 3 trial, Moderna enrolled 30,000 participants and Pfizer enrolled 40,000 participants. So between the two, that's 70,000 people. That's quite a large number of people to gather data on. If we look at the number of people with chronic lung disease, that was over 1,400 people in that trial, significant cardiac disease, also over 1,400, people who were overweight or obese, more than 10,000 in Moderna, almost 20,000 in the Pfizer trial. Liver disease, 196 people. HIV, when we talk about, immune status, HIV patients on their antiretroviral therapies, 176 patients. Diabetics, almost 3,000. People with high blood pressure, almost 9,000. People with any cancer of any type, almost 1,400 people. And so while these medical conditions were not specifically studied in this trial, they also were not excluded. And thousands of people with these chronic medical conditions were included in these trials because certainly we want to target people who are more vulnerable to COVID-19 who have the risk of having more complications, a more deleterious or dangerous hospital course, and even a higher risk of death. We want to make certain that those patients are also able to tolerate it. And I'll give you an example on heart disease. I'm a cardiologist. If a patient with an underlying cardiac problem, a heart problem, contracts COVID-19, they're 6 times more likely to be hospitalized in comparison to a patient with COVID-19 who does not have heart disease. They are 12 times more likely to die in comparison to a patient without heart disease. So we certainly want to make these vaccines available such that they have a degree of protection and preservation of their life. And so we want to think about all of those things. The other question that I often get is in relation to allergies. And so I'll briefly talk about that. I have allergies. Can I take this medication? Can I take this vaccine? And we have to remember that this is a messenger RNA vaccine. It is not a live virus. Our previous vaccines were live viruses that were attenuated, meaning that they were weakened to the point that they don't make you sick. But if you're injected with them, your body can recognize it such that you mount an immune response to protect yourself. These are called live attenuated viruses. This is a new platform. This is messenger RNA. So all of those allergies don't apply, the chickens, the eggs, these types of things, it doesn't apply. And the reason it doesn't apply is because the technology is different. So for instance, if you have environmental allergies, hay fever, allergies to bee stings, venom, food allergies, these are not things that apply to this technology. The couple of things that we have to consider is that if you've had severe anaphylaxis, is what we call it, anaphylaxis, but severe allergic reactions to a vaccine in the past, it's still not a contraindication, but you need to alert people when you're there to get your vaccine, and you need to wait for an additional 30 minutes such that you can be observed. The other thing to think about is if you have allergy to something called polyethylene glycol. Polyethylene glycol is a type of fat that this messenger RNA is encased in as the emulsion in which the liquid in which we inject you. Polyethylene glycol, you'll know you have an allergy to that because we find it commonly in laxatives or stool softeners like Miralax or Go Lightly or Colace. So if you've ever had a stool softener or a laxative and had an allergic reaction, that would be the only other consideration regarding allergies to these medications. When we look at the ingredients of the medications, the ingredients by and large are made up of lipids or fats, right? Like this polyethylene glycol, dihydroxybutyryl, diesteroyl. These are all types of fats or lipids. And then we also have sodium phosphate, sodium chloride, potassium phosphate, potassium chloride. These are all types of electrolytes or salts. And then there's sucrose, which is a type of sugar. So in essence, in addition to the messenger RNA, it floats in an emulsion of fats, sugars, and salts. There are no additives. And then the Moderna vaccine has something additional called tromethamine, which balances the acidity. So that's the entirety of what these vaccines are comprised of, and what the concern should be with allergies, which almost are non-existent. And the last thing that I will say about allergies is, if you take the first shot of Moderna and Pfizer and you have a reaction, a severe reaction, which is incredibly rare, but if you do, that would be a contraindication to getting your second shot. And so that would really be it. So it really involves everybody, almost, we can all do it, right? And even with these chronic medical problems, we are the people with chronic medical problems are the ones that we really want to identify, because your reserve is less if you were to get sick, and your risk of complications and hospitalization and a more complex hospital course is greater. And so we want to also consider these vaccines. One of the last things that I'm going to talk about is something called long haul syndrome. And you may have heard about it. This is a syndrome that develops in patients after they've had COVID. After you've recovered, you can begin to develop symptoms that go out as long as 9 months so far. We're tracking these patients, and probably longer. People complain of neurologic symptoms like loss of taste and smell, chronic headaches, something that's called brain fog, where you have periods of disorientation, you have difficulty with your memory. It's hard for you to return to work, where you have high-level tasks and things that you need to think about and recall, this brain fog. And then there are things that are also physically more deleterious, where we have these chronic inflammatory conditions around the heart, myocarditis, and around the lung that require chronic medications. This is all part of long haul syndrome that is poorly understood. But here's what we do know about it. Regardless of whether your disease, your COVID-19 course was incredibly complex and dangerous and life-threatening, and you were hospitalized, you were maybe in the intensive care unit, you were maybe even intubated, or if you just tested positive and you're pretty comfortable at home and you're sort of playing video games and marking time until 14 days is up and so you can be back out, you're pretty free. Both patients at both ends of the spectrum both have a 30% risk of developing long haul syndrome. It is independent of the severity of your disease. It also cuts across race, it cuts across gender, it cuts across socioeconomic status, it cuts across demographics. Currently, we have no way to predict which patients will move on to develop long haul syndrome. So in taking this vaccine, not only do you protect yourself from COVID, you protect yourself from that 30% risk of these long-term effects, regardless of how mild your symptoms are, that we know already are out at 9 months and counting for 30% of the population that contracted COVID. So these are all things to consider. Another question that I often receive, if I've had COVID, should I move forward with getting this vaccine? And the answer to that is yes, because beyond 90 days following your infection, we are unclear how long your natural immunity lasts. And so we definitely want you to receive both doses of these vaccines currently, such that we can ensure that you are covered as well. There's a lot of discussion that you may have heard, maybe it's in the scientific world and maybe you haven't heard it. So, you know, I read it all the time, but maybe you don't. So I'll preface that with saying there's a lot of discussion, but maybe you haven't heard it regarding whether or not, if you've had COVID, maybe you only need one shot when we talk about these Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. The reason that people are having that discussion is because they are debating whether the disease itself serves as an equalizer of that first shot. So you either get the first shot or you've had the disease. So the debate is, are those really the same, such that a person who's had COVID-19 maybe only needs one shot, which is really that second shot. So far, we want people to receive both shots because patients with COVID were also included in these trials of these 70,000 people. And those with COVID also received both doses in both of these trials. So that's the data that we have. We can have all these scientific discussions and all the extrapolations, but the data that was submitted to the FDA, even on patients who were COVID positive in the trials, was on 2 doses. That's the data that was approved that granted us emergency use authorization. And that's the information that we have. The other question that I get, can I get COVID? Or I've heard that people get COVID after they've taken their shots. And this is how that happens. You're either exposed to COVID immediately before your shot, or you can be exposed in the first 8 to 10 days after your shot, because when you receive that first injection, it takes your body about 8 to 12 days for your immune system to start to kick in. So during that time, you still are not protected. And if you come in contact with someone who's contagious with COVID-19, even though you've had the vaccine, you haven't had an opportunity to build your immunity yet in the first 8 to 12 days, so you can contract COVID. Additionally, as we move up to that second shot, remember, we only get into the area of around a flu shot, around 50 or 60%. So you still have a 40% chance, right, of contracting COVID. So we have to always be certain that we still follow all of our public health measures, wearing our mask, washing our hands, practicing social distancing, such that we're not only protecting ourselves, but that we protect others as well. There's, we have a couple of studies now coming out of Israel. These are observational studies, not randomized clinical trials, and that probably doesn't mean a lot to people, but the randomized clinical trials are the real, standardized placebo-controlled trials, but these are observational studies. And what they have found that I think is very interesting is that patients or people who receive the COVID vaccine, they recognized that even if they developed COVID afterwards, remember, it only protects you to 95%, right? So it's not 100%. So even if you contracted COVID after receiving the vaccine protects you to the point that your viral load is very low. So if you have any symptoms at all, they would be very mild. Additionally, because your viral load is so low, it decreases your risk of transmitting it to others. And if you do transmit it to others, you're transmitting such a low viral load that their inoculation is much less. And their course of COVID-19 is thought to be much milder. So not only do the vaccines protect you, they also protect those around you from more severe disease. And so that's something else that we need to think about when we think about sort of bringing these vaccines forward and what do they mean. I'm going to move just to one other area when we talk about race. When I looked at these FDA briefing documents that were submitted to Moderna and to Pfizer, I specifically wanted to take a look at some of the subpopulations that were included. So African Americans in the Moderna trial were included at 10.3%. And in the Pfizer trial, they were included at about 9.3 to 9.8%. And although we represent 13.4% of the population, and they fell short really of representing where we truly are in this mosaic of America, they actually still did a pretty good job because by and large, because of all types of historical atrocities and research being done that's been very nefarious against us, we don't really participate in clinical trials and research. That's really not common within the African American culture. In fact, our participation rate is probably somewhere at 4% or less. So for Moderna and Pfizer to have reached a combined average of about 10% in these trials, it demonstrated that they were purposeful and intentional in trying to reach out to the African American community and include them. And even though they did not reach 13.4%, they did a pretty good job. In fact, I have never seen a clinical trial that had 10% Black participation if the trial is not specifically targeted for a disease that's focused on the African Americans and only enrolling Blacks. I actually haven't seen that. So when I look at these trials, and don't forget, in combination, that's 70,000 people. If we have about 10% Blacks in this trial, that's 7,000 people. That is not insignificant. Further, when I look at the subpopulations within the FDA briefing documents, the Black population, 2 weeks following the second dose, had 0 incidences of COVID-19. And so another way to look at that is within the Black population, the efficacy of the vaccines was actually 100%. The overall efficacy of the vaccine was 95%, but the subpopulation of African Americans had 0 incidences of COVID-19 2 weeks following the second dose. So I think that that is significant for us to understand that there was representation and that the data coming out of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, we should have confidence that it has relevance to our populations and to all populations. The Hispanic population, by the way, was represented at 20% in Moderna and 26% in Pfizer. So again, well represented within these trials, and you should have confidence that the data coming out of these trials is relevant to your populations. So I will stop there. I went through a lot of topics, a lot of questions that I commonly get, but maybe there's some specifically that you'd like to ask me. Otherwise, I can just keep going and answer some other questions and give you guys some other information. Are there specific questions?
Yes, Dr. Morgan, we do have some questions. I will start with one that actually came from some of our viewers on our YouTube channel. Someone did ask about, you know, if they received the vaccine, of course, both doses or whatever combination that is required, would there still be a need to wear a mask out in public?
Right. And so let's walk through that. So we're talking right now, I know J&J is come out with their vaccine, but right now, let's talk about Moderna and Pfizer because J&J hasn't started any distribution at the moment. So Moderna's vaccines are given in 2 doses, 28 days apart. And then 2 weeks after that second dose is when you reach full immunity, that 94.5 or 95%. So it takes 6 weeks to complete that course of Moderna. The Pfizer vaccines are given 3 weeks apart, and then it requires an additional 1 week to reach that 95% efficacy. So the entire course of the Pfizer vaccine is 4 weeks. So there's a 2-week difference between those two, if that matters to you. However, at this point, I don't think we have a choice for you to choose one or the other, but that's just, you know, academic information for you to have. The safety and efficacy of these vaccines, and I have personally read these FDA briefing documents, is almost identical. The reason we have to continue to follow public health measures is because the vaccines are not 100%. So there's that 5% risk that you could still contract the virus. Additionally, you could also have an asymptomatic infection and be carrying the virus in your nose or throat and not be aware of it and turn yourself into a super spreader because you don't have on a mask and you're feeling pretty confident and infecting all these people around you, including people with these chronic medical conditions that they're managing who may not be as healthy as you are and not able to manage it as well. So we have to think about that. The other thing we need to think about is herd immunity. And what does that mean? That means that we need to get our society up to a certain percentage of people having immunity. At the moment, we're looking at somewhere between 80 and 85%. What that means is herd immunity is actually a term that comes from farmers. It actually means cattle. And we look at cowpox, and probably people don't remember cowpox because it was something that used to happen only in cows, but we actually used it to develop a smallpox vaccine. So that's another little historical question. But if you could keep a certain percentage of your herd immune, meaning they have protection from whatever the disease is that would be impacting cattle, then they learned that all of the cattle didn't need to be immune. You just need to have enough in your village, in your pod, that are immune, such that if they never get the disease, then the people who have no immunity also never get the disease because they're never exposed to anybody who has the disease. That's called herd immunity. What's that sweet spot where we have enough people immunized such that the disease no longer circulates in our society, and those who have not been immunized for whatever reason are still protected because everybody around them is healthy. So they have no way of contracting it. That's called herd immunity. One of the things that we're concerned about are these emerging and developing mutations. And maybe I'll take a moment to discuss mutations. In science, mutations really just mean change. It means something is changing. Organism is changing. It could be good, bad, indifferent, the same. Many times, believe it or not, an organism can mutate itself out of existence, just get weaker and weaker and less effective. But we also see that it is a survival mechanism by and which viruses, in this case, replicate and adapt and learn to survive, right? And so each time they come in contact with the human, which is their host, they can learn and they can change and make them a little less susceptible or more infectious. One thing that, probably we're not aware of is when we look at the mutations that have occurred in the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2, the virus responsible for COVID-19. This virus has replicated or mutated close to 3,000 times at this point. And so when we look at, in the United States, the amount of genomic tracing and tracking that we have done with the mutations that have circulated here in the United States, it really is an abomination. It is less than 0.5%, less than 1%. We by and large have done no genetic tracing and tracking. Our team was dismantled. It's just been disorganized, and it simply hasn't been done. So the irony in the scientific world is, as we point the fingers at the UK and at Brazil and South Africa because they have all these variants and we need to be concerned and look at what's in their environment. In the scientific world, we say, but at least they know what they have. They're at least testing and tracking. We don't even know what we have, and we're focused outside of the country. But here amongst us, we don't know what we are being exposed to. Now, currently, we've got this mutation that's, has developed in New York. One of the things we need to think about with mutations, vaccines, and herd immunity is that the virus will continue to change and try to survive. It only survives if it can find a host. The host is the human being. The human being is the key part of its entire life cycle. If we can remove ourselves from its life cycle via vaccines or public health measures, keeping our mask on, washing our face, washing our hands, practicing social distancing, then the virus can die out. It can't find a host such that it continue its life cycle. If we end up in a situation where we have what I call community immunity, meaning, people in one part of the city, for whatever reason, have adopted the vaccine and they are getting vaccinated at 95%, and they are all immune in their entire community. But 30 miles down the road, there's another community that has a low adoption rate, and they maybe only have 20% of protection. Only 20% develop and receive the vaccine. What could happen is that that community that's only 30 miles from you or 10 miles from you is susceptible to having mutations start to develop there, right? And then the community that had 95% adoption also become susceptible as that mutation spreads because their vaccine was developed before those mutations were created. So even though they are immunized, they may not be protected against the new mutations that were allowed to develop in a pocket of a community that did not get immunized. Because don't forget, the clinical trials are only as effective as the mutations that were around at the time people were being enrolled into the trials. So any mutations that developed after that, we don't have the information on them in those trials, not because the companies were negligent, they just didn't exist yet. So that's why it's important for all of us to think about how we're going to kind of move forward and move with these mutations. Because as the mutations develop and impact one group of people, these are mutations then that can theoretically begin to evade our vaccines and elude our vaccines. And I think we're seeing now that Pfizer and Moderna have developed a third formulation that is incorporating some neutralizing antibodies against some of these new mutations that were not around when they were enrolling their trials, and they've sent that data to the NIH for review. And that's why you hear talk about, will I need a third shot after the second shot? The third shot is to cover the mutations that weren't covered in the shots 1 and 2. So you can see how this is just like a snowball effect. And if we don't work to get ourselves to an immune state, we may end up talking about a fourth shot. We've got to get ahead of these mutations. And we can do it one of two ways, but preferably a combination, by immunizing ourselves and also using public health measures to protect ourselves, because the mutations are ever changing and evolving and trying to survive, the same as humans are trying to survive. So we're in a race against, right? We both want to survive. We are part of that life cycle. We've got to remove ourselves from the life cycle. The Homo sapien, the human being, is a part of the life cycle of this SARS-CoV-2. And even though you are protected, if your neighbor is not protected, your neighbor can put you at risk, because your neighbor then is a nidus for developing mutations for which your nice vaccine may not work. And so this is how we're sort of we need to come together and think about this and move this forward.
Awesome. Dr. Morgan, thank you so very much. We have actually gotten several questions from our viewers that are tuning in via YouTube again. We had a string of questions that centered around some viewers' interest in learning more about the vaccine and its effect on people with, one, a pre-existing condition like asthma, but we also have somebody asking about, somebody who's had renal failure or a transplant. So those are obviously 3 different scenarios, but I think they all kind of fit into the same category about people who have some kind of compromised state that might, play differently with the reaction to these vaccines.
Right. So I want to start with the transplant patients, because, the transplant patients are by and large, immunosuppressed because of the organ transplant. So I definitely want you to check with your physicians, but also I think your physician will probably say move forward with it. But also remember, you are the population that we want to protect because your reserve is less. So we do want you to think about moving these vaccines forward. Moderna in particular is about to start a COVID vaccination clinical trial specifically for kidney and liver transplant patients, such that they can have that direct information. So that's something to think about. Regarding asthma as well, again, always check with your physician. I'm not here to give you medical advice. I'm here to give you scientific data and information on the trials and information on COVID vaccine. You check with your physician. But by and large, again, this is a medical condition that we want to make certain that you are protected, because we certainly know that COVID-19 can impact your lungs in a very serious way. and that you can end up intubated and have a more complicated course. So I want you to check with your physician. I think these are great questions, but also seriously consider taking this vaccine to protect yourself.
So we've got another question. Let me, well, first off, you've got a lot of admirers out there and a lot of folks who are appreciative of the information you've been able to share. Somebody said it definitely sets their mind more at ease as, you know, and thinking about, you know, taking the vaccine. So that's always positive to hear. That's why we do these types of things. So let me get back to another question that we had from some folks. One question, you know, because we do know that a lot of people have already had COVID-19,
Right.
and you know, no community has been immune from that. But if they've had it and recovered, do they still need it? They still need the vaccine.
Yeah. So if you've had COVID-19, we still are asking that you receive the vaccine within 90 days of your recovery, because we're unclear how long natural immunity lasts. And at this point, and we'll timestamp it because, you know, the landscape is rapidly moving, but as of today, March 1st, 2021, we still want you to get both doses. As I said, there's this scientific discussion around whether people who've recovered from COVID actually only need the second dose, because the COVID disease itself is serving as the first dose. But I don't want to make it complicated for people. Right now, you're still getting 2 doses if you've had COVID. Here's something to think about. If you were treated with convalescent plasma or monoclonal antibody therapy as a part of your COVID treatment, these are IV infusions, so needles that go into your arms and they have bags of liquids and they're running something into you, then you must wait 90 days before receiving the COVID vaccine. So convalescent plasma or monoclonal antibody therapy, either of those, you have to wait 90 days before you receive your first dose of the vaccine. Yeah. Something else to think about, I'm just, you guys interrupt me. I'll just keep going.
Oh, you're good. You're good. Keep going.
Yeah. When we talk about shots, so people often ask, what about the flu shot? What about the measles shot? What about the shingles shot? Here is the answer to that. We want you to take all of your immunizations and all of your shots, including your flu shot, but you cannot do it within 2 weeks of taking this vaccine on either side. So 2 weeks before nor 2 weeks after. And the reason for that is if you were to develop side effects, it's hard then to tease if the side effects are due to one shot or the other. And I know it's much easier when you go to your physician to kind of get everything done at once. I'm here, just give me everything, draw all the blood, do everything, urine, I'm here, and I don't want to come back for a year. But in this case, we want you to make certain that you space it 2 weeks. And we do want you to get the flu shot. And the other thing that sometimes is a common misunderstanding or misnomer, and so I want to be clear, the flu shot does not protect you from COVID, and the COVID shot does not protect you from flu. 2 shots, 2 things. We want you to have them both 2 weeks apart. Don't stack them up close together, 2 weeks apart.
Awesome. Thank you so very much for that. Somebody wanted to, know if what happens if I don't get the second shot? I know you may have alluded to that a little bit, but why? What's the importance of that second shot?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you a bunch of different answers on that. So first, I'm going to give you the scientific answer. We do the second shot because that's how the clinical trials were done. That's the data that we have. And if you only get 1 shot, we don't really know what's going to happen to you because we don't have any data. That's the scientific answer. The second shot also provides you that 95%. So the first shot gets you around 50 or 60%. So you're around sort of in that area of the flu. But we know we get the flu shot and sometimes we can still get the flu. We want to take you up higher than that to provide that big protection. It's really, really knocking it out of the park. When you say 95% efficacy, most of us have never heard of that. As you say, the flu shot's only, 60 on a good year. So this was 95%. So we want you to have that second shot. So here's another answer to that question. When we look at some of the observational studies coming out of Israel, which is, a very confined population, a very specific population, it may or may not be relevant to the mosaic of America. And it's observational, not a randomized clinical trial. They didn't run a trial. They're just observing data. It appears that with the Pfizer vaccine, after one injection, that after a period of time, the protection does approach 85% or 90%. Again, this is an observational. In science, this is a key word, observational, meaning, can we prove it or not? It's nice fodder. It's nice for us to think about. It could be true. It is something that we've observed, but unless it's coming through a randomized clinical trial, it's hard for us to say it's real evidence. It could be true, but we just don't know. So that's the second answer to that. And then the third answer that I want us to think about, if you only get one injection, then you are only partially immunized. And you have become both a part of the solution and a part of the problem simultaneously. We appreciate you getting that first shot and having some immunity. That's somewhat helpful to society, right? You decrease your risk somewhat, but you also have increased your risk of creating mutations if you come in contact with COVID, because the COVID vaccine now has an opportunity to develop a mutation against the vaccine itself if you're only partially immunized. So you become sort of that walking person that concerns us when we talk about mutations. So there are three different answers to that question. I don't know which answer you're going to pick, but those are three answers to that question. And so this is what we mean when we say the data, the information is evolving. We're learning, so I'm going to time stamp this on March 1st, March 15th. We may have answers to something else and it may be very different. Right now, we are asking that you get both shots because that's what the data under which we have emergency use authorization demonstrates. Beyond that, we have no other data. That's what we're saying on March 1st.
Thank you so very much. Of course, we do have some other questions that have come in, and I know you may have touched on this subject or as part of your earlier portions of your presentation. But for those who are still a little hesitant about it because they're worried about side effects, what are those side effects that are known at this moment for either the first and or second dose of that vaccine?
Right. Great question. So what are the side effects? Most common side effects, fever, chills, nausea, vomiting, headaches, myalgias or muscle aches, and injection site pain. Most common side effects. These side effects are often more severe after the second shot than the first shot. I say that, but then I want to give a caveat. You may experience no symptoms at all. So if you don't experience any symptoms at all, don't think your immune system is not working. Everybody's reactions are different. So this is just for people who have symptoms. Generally, if you have symptoms, and everybody doesn't, your symptoms will be more severe after the second shot. Or if you don't have symptoms after the first shot, you're more likely to have them after the second shot. So the second shot really revs up our ribosomes. The other thing to think about when we're thinking about these shots is in the Pfizer group, if you're over 65 years of age, your side effects actually are much less. And in the Moderna group, if you're over 55 years of age, your side effects were much less. So we saw fewer side effects the older people were. And actually, it was younger people who had more side effects. And then the last thing that I would say is when you're considering getting the vaccine, consider getting it in your dominant arm. So what is your dominant arm? If you're right-handed, then your right arm is your dominant arm. If you're left-handed, then your left arm is your dominant arm. So why do I say get it in your dominant arm? Because we want you to use that arm such that you move the vaccination away from the injection site and decrease stiffness and soreness of that arm. When we receive vaccines in our non-dominant side, we tend to cradle or protect that arm, which actually works to prolong the symptoms. So the only caveat to that, let's say, if you're a surgeon or something, you're taking your shot and heading to the OR in 30 minutes, and you don't need your dominant arm to be sore because you're about to do, a pancreatectomy, that's an exception. But for the rest of us who are not headed right off to the OR, we probably can have some soreness in our dominant arm, using that arm a lot more during the day. Because if it's in our non-dominant arm, we tend to cradle. If it's our dominant arm, we tend to force ourselves to get through it, right? And that helps us really decrease our symptoms.
Well, you have now made me want to go to WebMD and look up pancreatectomy. So thank you for the new word of the day.
Somebody removing your pancreas.
Okay. I'm not here for that. I'm not, and no one else is either. So real quick, I know we're running out of time. We probably got about 3 minutes, and there are several questions that are in here. We will, for our viewers here, I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but I will say that everybody who has tuned in has been super appreciative of this information, and we could not be more appreciative of you as well for sharing your expertise with our school system and our school district and those beyond here. So with that being said, we will be sharing your presentation on our vaccination toolkit website. People can also tune back into YouTube and see all this wonderful information. And I know some of these questions that are coming in here late are very specific to the individuals who are asking. They're asking about certain conditions they may have, whether it be like seizures and epilepsy, if they should have something, if they are eligible to get that, or somebody even asked, what about a monoclonal antibody treatments for other diseases? Is it only for those with COVID? So there are some very specific questions. What would your answer to be to these, for these individuals about their very specific cases?
Yeah, and without knowing all the cases, I would definitely say speak with your physician, but also know that the trials did not exclude anyone. And people with chronic medical conditions, you're more susceptible and more at risk for more severe outcomes if you contract COVID-19, including death. So we certainly want you to consider these vaccines. And the last thing that I will say is I do have a public page on Instagram and Twitter and LinkedIn, Dr. Jayne Morgan. I do little 1-minute videos called the Stairwell Chronicles. And I generally answer one question about COVID in 60 seconds or less. So if you don't like what I say, you really haven't invested a lot of time in it, right? It's just been 60 seconds, you can move on. But sometimes people find it helpful. And so it's called the Stairwell Chronicles. If you follow me there, Dr. Jayne Morgan, is Jayne, on either Instagram or Twitter. I do post videos most days answering one question there. And, you can start to kind of just build up your knowledge and build up your information, one little chronicle at a time. You don't have to be overwhelmed with information. Now, today I talked about a lot of things, but on my Stairwell Chronicles, I just talk about one little snippet for a minute and then I'm gone. And you can just think about it.
All right, so folks, it does kind of run us up to the 1 hour limit that we had kind of placed on this. We can't thank people enough. And when we say we want to bring you the experts, let me just tell you real quick, because we didn't get a chance to really dive into Dr. Morgan's bio, because quite frankly, we'd be here for an hour talking about all the many accomplishments that she's had as a medical professional in her respective field. But one of the things that we wanted to share, of course, that she's the head of the clinic. She's the clinical director for the COVID task force at Piedmont Healthcare Corporation right here in Atlanta, here locally. And she's developing ongoing community outreach in conjunction with the Division of Diversity and Inclusion between Piedmont and the African-American communities it serves. Just such important stuff, all the way around, and we can't thank you enough. And with all that being said, I want to turn it over to Superintendent Davis to wrap us up today.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you, JD. And Dr. Jayne Morgan, we will all be following you. It has been an absolute breath of fresh air to have some one-on-one time with you and our educators in the Henry County community. But let me tell you one more thing, that while I was taking tons of notes and I really walked away with, I think, an elevated understanding of the science behind this body of work, obviously, in just continuing increase in my confidence in our partners in the Henry County community. We also just had an incredible biology lesson. So to all of our life science, biology, and AP bio teachers out there, I certainly hope there are elements that you see as standards aligned to our curriculum in those fields, and that this becomes a really helpful sort of expert on call in your classroom too. But Dr. Morgan, I can't thank you enough. We know that it's going to be a personal decision for the educators in our community. But we also know that by working together, we get to keep Henry healthy together. And thank you for helping us feel better informed, stay better informed, and make a personal decision here on the horizon as educators have access to the vaccine coming March 8th. Thank you for your time, Dr. Morgan. We appreciate you. Dr. Madden, thank you for your leadership on our own Henry County Schools vaccine strategy. And of course, JD Harden, thank you for hosting us today and for facilitating our YouTube access. I hope everybody has a great afternoon and stay in tune with your vaccination toolkit on the Henry County Schools website.
Thank you. Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Have a nice evening.
Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.